At exactly 3:47 a.m. on Tuesday, October 15th, 2024, veteran truck driver Mike Sullivan backed his 18-wheeler into an abandoned truck stop on Interstate 35 near Austin, Texas. He had exactly 45 minutes to transfer $17 million in Mexican Cartel cash from his trailer to a waiting van before the GPS tracking system came back online. The security cameras had been disabled weeks earlier by someone who knew exactly how the system worked by sunrise. Mike had vanished completely, leaving behind only his empty truck and a trail that would baffle federal agents for years. The man who made it all possible was a 55-year-old trucker who had lost everything during the pandemic. But this story didn't start with a desperate father stealing millions. It started 18 months earlier, when Mike Sullivan discovered that his regular freight route was being used to transport more money than most people see in a lifetime. Before I walk you through the full story, I just have a small favor to ask. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and let me know in the comments what city are you watching from. It's always amazing to see how far this audience is reaching. Now let's get back to the story. Mike Sullivan had been America's most reliable truck driver for 30 years. He owned Sullivan Trucking, a small company with 4 trucks that serviced routes across Texas and the Midwest. His drivers trusted him completely. His clients rated his service as exceptional. He'd never had a major accident, never missed a delivery, never caused problems for anyone. Mike earned decent money, lived in a modest house in suburban Dallas, and drove practical vehicles. He was divorced, but maintained a good relationship with his ex-wife, Jennifer. They had no major conflicts, and their adult daughter, Sarah, visited regularly from Colorado until March 2022. When everything in Mike's world collapsed in a matter of weeks, the call that would destroy Mike's life came on a Tuesday morning from his biggest client, Southwestern Agricultural Supply. They were terminating their contract immediately due to financial difficulties caused by supply chain disruptions. Rodriguez, the account manager, explained that Mike's company had provided excellent service for over a decade, but they could no longer afford freight services. "We're sorry," Mike Rodriguez said, "but we have to cut costs wherever we can find them. This isn't about your performance, it's about our survival." Mike's company lost 60% of its revenue in that single phone call, but Rodriguez had more devastating news. The other major clients were also struggling. Clearwater Manufacturing was filing for bankruptcy. Richardson Construction had laid off half their workforce and canceled all freight contracts. Texas Farm Equipment was moving their shipping in-house to save money. Within 6 weeks, Mike Sullivan lost every major client his company had serviced for years. The phone stopped ringing, the truck sat idle in his yard, and the bills kept coming every month. Mike spent the next 3 months desperately trying to find new clients, but the entire freight industry was struggling. Independent truckers were going bankrupt every week. Major shipping companies were laying off drivers and cutting routes. Small businesses couldn't afford freight services that they'd relied on for decades. Mike applied for jobs with large trucking companies, but at 55 years old, with his own business background, nobody wanted to hire him as an employee. "You're overqualified," they said. "You'll leave as soon as business picks up." By September 2022, Mike's situation had become desperate. The bank called in his business loans totaling $340,000. His house went into foreclosure. His trucks were repossessed one by one until only his personal 2018 Peterbilt remained. His ex-wife, Jennifer, filed for divorce modifications to eliminate alimony payments because Mike could no longer afford them. His credit was destroyed, his savings were gone, and he was living in his truck cab because he couldn't afford rent. The final humiliation came when Mike's daughter, Sarah, called from Colorado to offer him money. "Dad, I know things are tough right now," she said. "I can send you a few thousand to help with expenses." Mike was too proud to accept charity from his 28-year-old daughter, who was struggling to pay her own student loans and support her new baby. "I'm fine, sweetheart," he lied. "Just a temporary setback, I'll figure something out." But Mike wasn't fine. He was sleeping in truck stop parking lots, eating gas station hot dogs, and showering when he could afford the $12 fee at travel centers. Other drivers who used to work for him pretended not to recognize him when they saw him counting change to buy coffee. Mike Sullivan, who had once employed 8 people and owned a successful business, was now homeless at 55 years old, with no prospects and no hope. Then on October 3rd, 2022, Mike received a phone call that would change everything. A freight broker named Carlos Martinez had a job offer, Regular route Austin to Chicago agricultural equipment twice a week. Good money, $3,200 per load. Mike couldn't believe someone was finally offering him legitimate work that might save his life. Martinez explained that the client was very particular about reliability and discretion. They've had problems with drivers who ask too many questions or talk too much about their business. Martinez said, they need someone who just does the job and keeps his mouth shut. Mike agreed immediately. He was too desperate to care about the client's preferences for discretion. Martinez gave him an address for a warehouse in an industrial area outside Austin. Be there Thursday at midnight for your first pickup, Martinez said. And, Mike, remember what I said about keeping things professional? They don't like surprises. On Thursday night, Mike arrived at the warehouse address to find a large concrete building with no signs or identifying markers. The loading dock was illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights, and two men in expensive suits were waiting for him. They introduced themselves as Miguel and Roberto, but didn't offer last names or explain what company they represented. You're here to pick up irrigation equipment, Miguel said. 6 containers. Total destination is Chicago. You don't open the containers, you don't ask questions about the contents, and you follow the exact route we give you. Any problems with that arrangement? Mike looked at the containers being loaded onto his trailer by forklift operators. They were industrial-grade metal boxes about the size of large refrigerators. Each one took 2 men to position properly, suggesting they were extremely heavy. What kind of irrigation equipment weighs this much, Mike? Asked. Miguel's expression hardened immediately. The kind that pays your bills, he said. You got a problem with the weight distribution? We can find another driver. Mike backed down quickly. He needed this job too badly to cause problems, but as he watched the loading process, he noticed details that didn't make sense. The containers were lead-lined, which seemed unnecessary for agricultural equipment. The warehouse had more security cameras than most banks, and the men supervising the loading were clearly armed underneath their suit jackets. Most importantly, the containers were marked with symbols that didn't match any agricultural equipment manufacturer Mike had ever seen during the drive to Chicago. Mike tried to convince himself that his suspicions were unfounded. Maybe the client was just extremely security conscious about their proprietary equipment. Maybe the weight came from dense machinery components. Maybe the lead lining was for protecting sensitive electronics from electromagnetic interference. But deep down, Mike knew he was transporting something illegal. He just didn't know what the delivery in Chicago took place at another unmarked warehouse in an industrial district. The unloading was supervised by different men, but with the same professional demeanor and concealed weapons. Mike was paid in cash, $3,200 exactly as promised, and told to return to Austin the following Tuesday for another pickup. You did good, Miguel told him over the phone. Client is satisfied. With your professionalism, keep it up, and this could be steady work for a long time. For the first time in months, Mike could afford a motel room, a real meal, and a shower. He started thinking maybe he could save his truck, maybe even rebuild his business. But that night, lying in a cheap motel bed, Mike couldn't shake the feeling that he had crossed a line. He'd spent 30 years building a reputation for honest dealing and legitimate business. Now he was taking money for transporting mysterious cargo with no questions asked. Over the next month, Mike made 8 trips between Austin and Chicago. Each time the routine was identical. Midnight pickup, 6 containers, exact route specifications, Chicago delivery and cash payment. The money kept him ahead of his creditors and gave him hope for the first time since his business collapsed. But Mike's suspicions continued growing. The security around the operation was far too sophisticated for agricultural equipment. The guards were clearly professional. The warehouses had military-grade surveillance systems, and everyone involved spoke in code words that suggested illegal activity. Mike also noticed that he wasn't the only driver servicing this route. He saw other trucks with similar cargo at both warehouses and overheard conversations suggesting this was part of a much larger operation. Been doing this run for 2 years, another driver named Carlos told him at a truck stop. Don't ask questions, don't cause problems, collect your money. That's how you stay healthy in this business. When Mike asked what Carlos thought they were really transporting, Carlos just stared at him coldly. I transport irrigation equipment, he said. That's all I know, and that's all you should know. But Mike's careful observation was already revealing the truth about his cargo. During his 10th trip, a forklift operator accidentally dropped one of the containers while loading it onto Mike's trailer. The container split open, and bundles of cash scattered across the warehouse. Floor guards immediately surrounded the area, screaming at workers in Spanish while frantically collecting the money. Miguel appeared within seconds, his face furious. "Clean this up immediately," he shouted, "and get rid of anyone who saw what happened." For a terrifying moment, Mike thought Miguel was talking about killing witnesses. Then he realized Miguel meant firing the forklift operator that night. Mike sat in his truck calculating what he had witnessed if each container held that much cash, and there were usually 6 containers per load. He had been transporting between $2 and $3 million per trip over 3 months. He had moved more than $20 million for what was obviously a money laundering operation. The agricultural equipment story was complete fiction. He was working for criminals moving drug money across state lines. Mike's moral dilemma became crushing. He knew he should quit immediately and report the operation to federal authorities, but he also knew that anyone who had seen this much of their business wouldn't be allowed to simply walk away. Carlos had warned him that quitting wasn't really an option for drivers who knew too much about the operation. Mike had seen the armed guards. He understood the sophistication of their security, and he realized that he was trapped between continuing to commit crimes and probably being killed for trying to leave. Worse, Mike's financial situation was still desperate. The money from these trips was barely keeping him afloat. He couldn't afford to lose this income, even if it meant continuing to transport drug money for Mexican cartels. His truck payment was 3 months behind, his insurance was about to be canceled, and he had less than $800 in his bank account. Quitting this job meant returning to homelessness and financial ruin. Staying meant becoming a permanent part of a criminal organization. On November 15, 2022, Mike's situation became even more complicated. Miguel assigned him a special delivery. "Next Tuesday, you'll be transporting our biggest shipment ever," Miguel explained. $17 million in cash that needs to reach Chicago for a major business transaction, extra security, extra precautions, and extra payment for you $5,000 instead of the usual $3,200. Miguel's tone made it clear this wasn't a request, it was an order with no option to decline. Mike spent the weekend researching money laundering operations and trying to understand exactly what he had become involved with. What he discovered was terrifying. The route he was driving was part of a sophisticated network that moved hundreds of millions of dollars annually, from drug sales across the Midwest to laundering operations in Mexico. His role was small but crucial. He was helping finance cartels that killed thousands of people every year through drug trafficking and violence. But Mike also realized that this enormous shipment represented an opportunity if he was going to be trapped in this criminal operation for the rest of his life. He might as well secure his future financially. $17 million was more money than he could earn in multiple lifetimes. If he could steal even a portion of it, he could disappear permanently and live comfortably somewhere the cartels could never find him. Using his 30 years of trucking experience, Mike began planning the most sophisticated theft in his life. What followed was 18 months of meticulous preparation that would make professional criminals envious. Mike approached the planning with the same methodical precision he had used to build his trucking business, except now he was designing a crime that would need to be absolutely perfect. Mike's first step was understanding exactly how the cartel's security systems worked. He spent weeks observing the loading and unloading procedures at both warehouses, noting the positioning of security cameras, guard rotation schedules, and communication protocols. He discovered that the guards used encrypted radios that operated on specific frequencies and that they maintained contact with supervisors every 30 minutes. During transport, the GPS tracking system became Mike's primary focus because he knew it was the most sophisticated element of their security. Mike researched commercial GPS tracking technology and learned that most systems used cellular networks to transmit location data but had backup batteries that maintained functionality for exactly 45 minutes during power outages. Mike spent hundreds of hours online studying electromagnetic pulse devices and discovered that truckers sometimes used EMP generators to disable electronic logging devices when they wanted to exceed federal driving time limits. Mike's breakthrough came when he found detailed instructions on internet forums used by independent truckers who shared techniques for avoiding DOT enforcement. The forums contained step-by-step guides for building EMP devices using readily available electronic components. Mike carefully studied these instructions and began acquiring the necessary parts through different suppliers to avoid creating suspicious purchasing patterns. He bought capacitors from electronics stores, resistors from hobby shops, and copper wire from hardware stores, spreading his purchases across 3 states while researching EMP technology. Mike also began mapping his regular route between Austin and Chicago, looking for locations where an electromagnetic pulse would be most effective. He needed a spot where cellular towers were far enough apart to create natural dead zones in GPS coverage, and where construction or industrial activity would provide plausible explanation for electronic interference. The construction zone near mile marker 197 on Interstate 35 became Mike's target location. The area was scheduled for bridge repairs that would last 18 months, providing perfect cover for electronic interference. Finding the perfect transfer location required months of careful scouting. Mike needed a place that was isolated enough to avoid witnesses, but accessible enough for heavy equipment. After evaluating dozens of potential sites, Mike settled on an abandoned truck stop that had been closed for 5 years due to highway rerouting. The facility still had working electrical connections and enough space for the portable crane that would be necessary for transferring heavy containers. Mike's most delicate challenge was recruiting assistance. Without exposing his plan, he needed someone with mechanical expertise who could operate heavy equipment and who was desperate enough to take enormous risks for substantial payment. Ultimately, he decided that Danny Morrison was his best option. Danny had worked as Mike's primary mechanic for 8 years and was struggling financially after losing his job. When Mike's trucking company collapsed, approaching Danny required careful psychological manipulation. Mike couldn't reveal the true nature of his plan without creating evidence that could be used against both of them if the operation failed. Instead, Mike gradually introduced the idea of a special project that would involve significant money and some legal risk over several months. Mike slowly revealed more details about his plan without explicitly stating that he intended to steal money from Mexican cartels. By November 2022, Mike had created a criminal plan that rivaled the sophistication of operations conducted by professional intelligence agencies. He had studied GPS tracking systems and discovered they had backup batteries that lasted exactly 45 minutes. During power failures, he researched the route and identified construction zones that created natural dead spots. In tracking coverage, he mapped back roads and abandoned locations that could serve as transfer points. Most importantly, he contacted his former mechanic Danny Morrison, who was also struggling financially, and asked for help with a special project. Mike's plan was technically brilliant, but extremely dangerous. He would trigger an electromagnetic pulse to disable the GPS tracking system during a construction zone delay, then divert to an abandoned truck stop where Danny would be waiting with a van and portable crane. They would transfer all 6 containers of cash from Mike's trailer to Danny's van, then fill Mike's trailer with concrete blocks to maintain proper weight. When the GPS came back online, Mike would continue to Chicago with fake cargo, while Danny hid the $17 million in storage units rented under false identities. The plan required precise timing, perfect execution, and enormous risk. If anything went wrong, Mike would be killed by cartel security or spend the rest of his life in federal prison. But Mike had reached the point where he felt he had nothing left to lose. His business was destroyed, his reputation was ruined, his family relationships were strained, and he was living in his truck cab at 55 years old. This theft represented his only chance to escape poverty and build a new life somewhere far away from his failures. On Tuesday, November 22nd, 2022. Mike arrived at the Austin warehouse for the biggest pickup of his criminal career, 6 containers each holding nearly $3 million in cash from drug sales across 12 states. The money represented 3 months of collections from the cartel's entire Midwest operation and was destined for Mexican banks that would launder it through legitimate business transactions. Miguel personally supervised the loading. "This shipment cannot be lost," he told Mike. "Too many important people are depending on this money reaching its destination. Security will be extra tight tonight. 4 guards in 2 vehicles will follow you. Any deviation from the planned route, any unexpected stops, and they will intervene immediately." Mike acknowledged the instructions while his heart pounded with anticipation and terror. In less than 3 hours, he would either Be $17 million richer or dead. He had rehearsed every step of his plan dozens of times, but he knew that even the smallest mistake could be fatal. The guards following him were armed professionals who would kill him without hesitation if they suspected he was stealing from their organization at 12:17 a.m. Mike pulled out of the warehouse parking lot with $17 million in cash loaded onto his trailer behind him. Two black SUVs with tinted windows began following. At a discreet distance, radio contact was established immediately. Checkpoint 1 clear. Mike reported proceeding north on Interstate 35, estimated arrival in Chicago, 8 a.m. for the first hour. Everything proceeded exactly according to plan. Mike maintained steady speed radio contact every 30 minutes and normal GPS tracking. But at mile marker 197 near the construction zone Mike had scouted for weeks, he activated the electromagnetic pulse device he had built, using instructions downloaded from internet forums. The device sent a powerful electronic surge through his truck's electrical system, instantly disabling the GPS tracking radio communication and all electronic monitoring equipment. The truck continued running normally, but all connection to the outside world was severed immediately. Mike took the pre-planned exit ramp, heading toward the abandoned truck stop where Danny was waiting with equipment for the transfer operation behind him. The security guards realized they had lost all contact and GPS tracking, but the construction zone and poor lighting prevented them from seeing exactly where Mike's truck had gone. They radioed frantically to their supervisors while speeding up to try to locate the missing truck. Mike reached the abandoned truck stop at exactly 3:47 a.m., where Danny was waiting with a rental van and portable crane. "Jesus, Mike, what kind of trouble have you gotten yourself into?" Danny asked, while connecting the crane to the first container. "The kind that's going to save both our lives," Mike replied. "But we have exactly 38 minutes to finish this before the GPS comes back online." Working with practiced efficiency developed through decades of trucking experience, Mike and Danny transferred all 6 containers from the truck trailer to the van. Each container weighed nearly 400 pounds and required careful handling to avoid damage or spillage. The portable crane made the work possible, but it was still physically demanding and extremely time-sensitive. Every minute that passed brought them closer to the moment when the cartels would realize their money had been stolen. By 4:23 a.m., all 6 containers were loaded into Danny's van and covered with tarps. Mike filled his trailer with concrete blocks wrapped in plastic to maintain the proper weight distribution for GPS sensors. When they reactivated, Danny drove away immediately, heading for storage facilities where the money would be hidden, while Mike completed his cover story. "If anyone asks, you don't know anything about this," Mike told Danny. "As far as you're concerned, I called you for help with a mechanical problem, and you never saw what was in those containers." At 4:25 a.m., exactly 45 minutes after the electromagnetic pulse, Mike's GPS and radio systems came back online immediately. His radio crackled with urgent communications. "Mike, where the hell have you been?" Miguel's voice was filled with suspicion and anger. "We lost all contact for 45 minutes. What happened to your truck?" Mike had prepared for this moment and delivered his cover story with convincing confusion. "GPS went dead somewhere in that construction zone," he said. "I thought you guys were following me the whole time. Radio was completely dead until just now. Must have been some kind of electronic interference from the construction equipment." Miguel wasn't satisfied, but had no immediate evidence of wrongdoing. "Maintain radio contact every 15 minutes for the rest of the trip," he ordered. "Any more communication problems, and we're going to have serious issues." Mike acknowledged the instructions while continuing toward Chicago with concrete blocks instead of cash. His performance had to be perfect for the next 4 hours until he reached the delivery point. Any sign of nervousness or suspicious behavior would trigger an investigation that would quickly reveal the theft during the drive to Chicago. Mike maintained normal radio contact and driving patterns while Danny systematically emptied the containers in secure storage facilities across 3 states. The money was being converted to gold jewelry, cryptocurrency, and other portable assets that could be easily transported and converted anywhere in the world. Mike had spent months researching money laundering techniques and establishing the infrastructure necessary to disappear permanently with his stolen fortune. At 8:15 a.m., Mike backed his trailer up to the Chicago warehouse loading dock for what would be his final delivery. Workers immediately began unloading the containers, but within minutes, chaos erupted. "The containers are full of concrete blocks," one worker shouted. "The money is gone. Someone stole $17 million." Guards surrounded Mike's truck with weapons drawn, while supervisors screamed into their radios reporting the theft to cartel leadership. Mike's performance during the next hour was critical to his survival. He acted shocked and confused by the discovery, demanding to know how concrete blocks had replaced cash containers. "I never stopped except for the GPS malfunction," he insisted. "Check the tracking records. I was never off route, except for that 45-minute dead zone in the construction area." His story was technically accurate. The GPS record showed no deviation from the planned route after the 45-minute gap, and the weight sensors had registered normal cargo load throughout the trip. Federal investigation began immediately. Because the theft occurred during interstate transport, FBI assumed it was an inside job involving warehouse security or guards, but their initial focus was on employees with access to the containers. Before loading, Mike appeared to be a victim rather than a suspect. His driving record showed no deviation from planned routes, and multiple witnesses confirmed his apparent shock at discovering the theft, but the cartel had no interest in federal investigation procedures. Miguel ordered immediate interrogation of everyone involved in the operation. Warehouse workers, guards, supervisors, and drivers were all suspected of complicity in the theft. Mike knew his life was in extreme danger. Even though investigators couldn't prove his guilt, he had seen too much of their operation to be allowed to survive the investigation that night. Mike abandoned his truck at the Chicago warehouse and vanished. He had already transferred his personal belongings to Danny's van and established multiple false identities for his escaped federal agents, arrived at his last known address to find only an empty truck cab and a note, "Gone fishing, back never." The note was deliberately casual, suggesting Mike was taking a short break rather than fleeing permanently over the next 72 hours. Mike's theft triggered massive investigations by both federal law enforcement and cartel security teams. FBI agents focused on warehouse employees and security protocols, while cartel investigators used enhanced interrogation techniques on anyone who might have information about the missing money. Both investigations reached the same conclusion: the theft required inside knowledge of GPS system security, procedures, and transportation logistics that only a few people possessed. Mike Sullivan emerged as the primary suspect because he was the only person with opportunity, motive, and expertise necessary for such a sophisticated theft, but proving his guilt was impossible. The GPS gap could have been caused by legitimate electronic interference. His financial desperation provided motive, but wasn't evidence of criminal activity, and his trucking expertise enabled the theft, but didn't prove he had committed it. Meanwhile, the cartel was conducting its own investigation. Miguel had been demoted following the theft and was desperately trying to recover the missing money to save his own life. Cartel leadership blamed him for inadequate security and poor vetting of drivers. The cartel began targeting Mike's known associates and family members. His ex-wife Jennifer was kidnapped from her home in Dallas and held for 3 days, while cartel operatives demanded information about Mike's whereabouts. Jennifer genuinely knew nothing about Mike's criminal activities, and the cartel eventually released her with a warning. Mike's daughter Sarah was placed under surveillance by cartel operatives. The stress of being watched constantly took a severe psychological toll on Sarah. She stopped sleeping properly and eventually had to take leave from her job because she couldn't concentrate on work. 6 months after the theft, Mike had successfully converted most of the stolen money to untraceable assets and established a new identity in a country without extradition treaties with the United States. Danny had been questioned extensively by federal agents, but maintained complete ignorance about Mike's criminal activities. Mike said he was going fishing. Danny told investigators, "I haven't heard from him since that night in Chicago." The investigation consumed enormous resources at multiple federal agencies over 18 months, but produced no arrests. Mike had vanished so completely that some investigators began to suspect he was dead, possibly killed by the cartel, to prevent him from revealing information about their operations, while federal agents and cartel investigators searched for him. Mike was living quietly in a small coastal town in Belize under the identity of Thomas Richardson, a retired construction contractor from Nebraska. Mike had purchased the identity from professional forgers. The identity came with complete background history that would pass detailed government Scrutiny. Mike's new life was deliberately modest. He rented a small house near the beach and told neighbors he was living on construction savings. The separation from his daughter was the most painful consequence of his theft, but Mike believed it was necessary to protect her from cartel retaliation. Miguel was eventually executed by cartel leadership for failing to recover the stolen money. The cartel authorized a $1 million bounty for information leading to Mike's capture or confirmed death. The bounty was offered through underground networks in Mexico, Central America, and South America. 18 months after the theft, FBI forensic accountants discovered cryptocurrency transactions that matched Mike's money laundering activities. The transactions had been traced to exchanges in Belize and Guatemala. Special Agent Martinez coordinated with law enforcement agencies in both countries to investigate American expatriates who had arrived during the relevant time period. The investigation in Belize lasted 3 months and came close to discovering Mike's identity. Federal agents interviewed dozens of American expatriates, including several who lived near Mike's house, but Mike's cover identity was sophisticated enough to pass casual scrutiny, and he was never directly questioned by investigators. The federal investigation eventually concluded. Without identifying Mike as a suspect, Agent Martinez was convinced that their target was in Central America but lacked specific evidence to justify expanded operations. The investigation had consumed enormous resources and produced no concrete leads, forcing FBI leadership to reassign agents to other cases. 3 years after the theft, Mike realized that he had successfully escaped both federal prosecution and cartel vengeance, but had trapped himself in a life of permanent exile from everything he had ever cared about. Mike began drinking heavily and contemplating suicide as the only escape from the psychological torture of permanent exile. But Mike's self-destructive spiral was interrupted by news that changed his perspective. FBI raids triggered by evidence from the missing $17 million had resulted in the arrest of over 60 people involved in the cartel's American operations. The raids had seized hundreds of millions of dollars in assets and disrupted drug trafficking networks across 12 states. More importantly, the investigation had led to the rescue of dozens of victims of human trafficking who had been held in warehouses and safe houses throughout the cartel's network. Mike learned that his theft had triggered the largest anti-trafficking operation in federal law enforcement history, saving the lives of women and children who had been enslaved by the same organization he had robbed. This information provided Mike with a sense of moral justification that helped stabilize his deteriorating mental health. He began to see his theft not as a selfish crime, but as an action that had ultimately saved innocent lives and destroyed a criminal organization that caused enormous suffering. Mike's drinking decreased as he found purpose in monitoring news reports about ongoing prosecutions and rescues resulting from the investigation. Mike also began using his hidden wealth to anonymously fund anti-trafficking organizations and victim support programs throughout Central America. He couldn't return the stolen money to its original owners because they were criminals, but he could use it to fight against the same types of crimes that the cartel had committed 4 years after the theft. Mike received encrypted communication from Danny, confirming that federal and cartel investigations had been officially suspended. Law enforcement agencies had concluded that Mike was either dead or permanently beyond their reach. The cartel had written off the stolen money as a business loss. This news allowed Mike to relax his security precautions and begin developing more normal social relationships in his adopted community. He started volunteering at local schools, teaching English to children, and helping with community development projects. His cover identity as a retired contractor provided credible explanation for his construction knowledge. Mike's volunteer work brought him into contact with Maria Santos, a local teacher whose husband had been killed by drug traffickers. Maria was raising 2 young children alone while working to improve educational opportunities in their community. Gradually, Mike and Maria developed a friendship based on their shared commitment to helping local children. Maria's kindness helped Mike begin healing from the psychological damage caused by years of exile. 5 years after the theft, Mike remained haunted by the separation from his daughter Sarah, who had married and started a family during Mike's absence. She named her son Michael after her missing father, and often posted photos with captions about hoping her dad would somehow see them. Working through Danny as an intermediary, Mike established an educational trust fund for his grandson. Using money laundered through legitimate investments, the trust fund was structured to provide full college funding, without revealing its source. Sarah received notification from attorneys who claimed it was established by an anonymous benefactor who wished to help families affected by unsolved crimes. Sarah chose to believe the anonymous benefactor was someone who knew her father personally and wanted to honor his memory. Mike's life in Belize had achieved stability, but the emotional cost remained enormous. He had successfully stolen $17 million from dangerous criminals, evaded international law enforcement, and destroyed a criminal network that trafficked drugs and humans, but the price was permanent exile from his family. During quiet evenings, Mike would calculate whether the theft had been worth its consequences financially. He was secure for life emotionally. He was isolated from everyone he loved. Psychologically, he struggled with guilt and anxiety, but Mike's perspective began changing as he learned more about the long-term consequences of his theft. The disruption of the cartel's money laundering network had cascading effects throughout their entire organization. Drug trafficking operations across the Midwest had been severely damaged by the loss of financial infrastructure. More importantly, the investigation triggered by Mike's theft had led to increased law enforcement cooperation between American and Mexican agencies that resulted in ongoing operations against organized crime networks. 10 years after the theft, Mike received news that fundamentally changed his understanding of his situation. Federal prosecutors had declassified portions of the investigation that revealed the cartel's American operations had been under surveillance for 3 years before Mike's theft. Law enforcement agencies had been building a case against the entire network, but lacked sufficient evidence. For major prosecutions, Mike's theft had provided the catalyst that triggered immediate federal action to prevent the loss of additional evidence and assets. The investigation that followed had been planned for months, but required a precipitating event that would justify extensive raids and arrests. Mike had unknowingly provided law enforcement with the legal justification they needed to destroy the entire criminal organization. This information suggested that Mike's theft hadn't simply triggered a law enforcement response, but had actually accelerated a planned operation that might have taken years to develop. Through conventional investigation techniques, Mike began to wonder whether federal agents had been aware of his planning and had allowed the theft to proceed because it served their larger law enforcement objectives. But Mike never learned the truth about law enforcement knowledge of his plans, and eventually stopped speculating about whether he had been an unwitting asset in a federal operation. The important fact was that his actions had ultimately served justice by destroying criminals and saving innocent lives, regardless of whether law enforcement had anticipated or encouraged his theft. FBI Special Agent Sarah Martinez, who led the investigation, admitted that Mike Sullivan was one of the most sophisticated criminals she had ever pursued. He wasn't just a desperate trucker who got lucky. She explained, this was a carefully planned operation that required months of preparation and professional-level expertise in transportation logistics and financial crime. Mike understood exactly what he was doing every step of the way. The case officially remains open, but no new leads have developed in over 2 years. Mike Sullivan is still listed on federal wanted lists, with a substantial reward for information leading to his capture, but law enforcement officials privately acknowledge that the trail has gone completely cold. Meanwhile, the cartel operation Mike exposed through his theft was completely dismantled, following the massive investigation triggered by the missing $17 million. Over 40 people were arrested across 6 states. Hundreds of millions of dollars in assets were seized, and the entire money laundering network was destroyed. Mike's theft had accomplished far more than enriching himself. It had triggered the largest cartel bust in Texas history and potentially saved thousands of lives by disrupting drug trafficking operations today. Mike Sullivan remains a legend among truckers who see him as a working man who outsmarted both federal agents and Mexican cartels to secure his financial future. Some drivers claim to have seen him at truck stops in Central America, while others insist he's living quietly somewhere in the United States under a completely new identity. But despite numerous reported sightings and ongoing investigations, Mike Sullivan has never been found. The abandoned truck stop where Mike transferred $17 million in cartel cash has become something of a pilgrimage site for truckers who respect his audacity and planning. Every Tuesday morning at exactly 3:47 a.m., Someone places fresh flowers at the location where the theft occurred, then disappears before. Sunrise security cameras have never captured a clear image of the person responsible, but many believe it's Mike Sullivan himself, still operating in the shadows, and still managing to outwit everyone who has tried to catch him, whether Mike Sullivan is alive or dead, wealthy or struggling, hiding in fear or living openly under a new identity somewhere far away. Nobody knows for certain. But here's what we absolutely know happened that Tuesday morning in November: $17 million in blood money never reached its intended destination. A powerful cartel suffered a devastating blow that destroyed their entire American operation. A desperate trucker became a folk hero who inspired others to fight back against seemingly impossible circumstances. And somewhere in the world, Mike Sullivan is either living proof that sometimes the little guy can win, or he's a cautionary tale about the price of crossing the most dangerous criminals on earth. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one.